how we used to work more than 40 hours. Is that the right amount? So we talked about that too. And we also talked about the type of work you do. So manual work or versus like laborious work versus more like mental work. How we used
Did I lose you guys?
No, we're here. I'm here.
I'm here still.
Okay.
Did you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
but
I'm just going to turn my volume up a little.
I think one of the challenges that we had last week is that for quite some time, some people were talking about political freedom and some people were talking about personal freedom. And those are two different things.
I don't remember anyone talking about political freedom last time, but maybe I'm just not remembering fully. Who's talking about political freedom? You? Sorry, my bad. But I swear
I often don't register in people's memories, so it's okay.
no, it's okay. It's okay because it's been a week, so maybe we don't really quite understand. I mean, we don't quite remember, but I am remembering now. So yeah, I mean, it takes a while because it's been a week, and we did talk about other things as well. But yeah, I think that's a great start actually, and I would kind of build on what you just said, David. And I did think about that a little bit after our conversation, and yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think that was kind of the problem with the conversation in the sense that we were getting a little bit lost on what kind of freedom we were talking about.
Or
and
some
I would
of it.
say, yeah. And I would say for me, at least, like I thought about it a little bit, there's at least, it's all freedom, right? It's all freedom, but there are at least three basic kinds of freedom. They're pretty different from each other, even though they all have something in common. And I would say the thing they have in common is that freedom is when you are able to do what you really want, right? And the lack of freedom is like when something stops you from doing whatever you want. But there are different scenarios, right? So there are at least three different scenarios, so to speak. You know, personal freedom, like slaves, for example, they had no personal freedom, right? Just to give a very radical example. Political freedom, which is, you know, another radical example, people in totalitarian states like communist Russia, they had very little political freedom because they couldn't even talk, you know, meet and talk about things that they wanted to. And another type of freedom, which to me, I think it's very important, and that's something that we have very little as a whole in society today, I think, is economic freedom, which is basically the freedom to live your life without being concerned with say the next paycheck, or, you know, you have to do some things just in order to pay your bills. So I would say, just to start it out, I think, you know, we have at least three different kinds of freedom, but, you know, you guys can probably think of other kinds as well.
Sure. I think like somebody said like something about political freedom, right? So a good example is 1947 in India. When the British left, we were always thinking, oh, we'll be free once the Brits go, once this colonialism ends. And once that ends, yeah, we were free politically, you know. But I think there's also something which is spiritual freedom, and I don't know how to be free, but I think like there are all these ropes which, you know, like which limit you. You kind of like cut these ropes one at a time, and then you find more ropes, and then you cut more of them, and then you kind of become free. That's like the quest of, like, you know, your spiritual freedom, as I see it, you know.
Right, and in that case, you're talking about maybe a government that's a little bit more bureaucratic and has a different culture to that. You're kind of like, you know, it certainly doesn't feel like freedom when another group comes in and imposes like its government system and culture on an existing, you know, group.
Right.
That seems to be a restriction on freedom, right?
Yes. So I was just making a distinguishing between political freedom and your individual self-existence, you know. What
Right.
individually means to you. And then, like, of course, there's this political thing which can vary based on so many different variables, you know.
It's complex. I mean, it kind of reminds me of, Plato when he talks about, or even just the Greeks, right? They had many different words for love. And there's probably, I mean, in some sense, you could probably come up with different words for freedom if you had a different language in terms of what exactly we're talking about here. And I don't know, in
So
general,
some of the struggle may not be our thoughts, but the language.
I think it's even more than, the language, because language means something, right? So like, when we're talking about different, words for love, we're not talking about just words, we're talking about concepts, whether a family relationship is different than, a sexual relationship versus like a relationship between a spouses. And I think same thing with freedoms, we can talk about them very, differently, but what's kind of fundamental about all forms of freedom? Is it just the restriction? Because I think that's an interesting question too, where sometimes we need to restrict in order to add to freedom as well. I mean, that's the concept, at least in the United States, that, we have laws in place, we restrict, the free market in some sense in order to protect freedom. Does that seem totally?
And we restrict the government. The government is not allowed to make laws that impinge on free speech.
Right. So is that, I mean, freedom is a complicated kind of question, because freedom does not just mean a restriction, right? It's about almost a balance of restrictions.
Yeah, and we kind of talked about that last time, Bruno, if you remember, where like we were talking about people who say having to wear a mask is taking away your freedom. And it depends on your definition of freedom. If by freedom you mean any restriction, then yes, by definition, it would be impinging on your freedom. But if you mean like a balance or kind of a just trade-off, then I guess by that definition, it wouldn't be.
I understand what you're saying, Michael, but I wonder if it can be properly viewed as restricting the freedom of other people by asking them to wear a mask, or protecting the freedom of everyone else.
So
Does that make sense?
So
Yeah.
I
I'm sorry, go on, Bruno.
Oh yeah, and then I'll give it'll be your turn, Michael. Sorry about that. So yeah, I think that we have a pretty good start. So we're gonna talk about freedom. So the first thing, what is freedom? I think Allison, you can talk about that a little bit more later. But it's a good point. It's not just about doing what you want to do. Freedom also apparently implies some sort of balance. So we have to balance what you want to do with what is reasonable for you to do, and the freedom of others and all that. And then you can talk more about the mask thing, Michael. But that the restriction to wear masks, or the imposition for some people to wear masks in order to protect the health of others, I think that's a good example that we can start by discussing that. And yeah, we have and I would say that's political freedom, right? That's political freedom, but I don't know if that's also personal freedom. And then we can also talk about economic freedom afterwards. So we can talk about what is freedom, and also the different kinds of freedom and how that applies to today's context. But yeah, if you want to talk about that mask thing, Michael, and zero in on that.
Yeah, just shortly. I mean, I feel like a lot of it is semantics, but like the way I would say it is requiring people to wear a mask, I would say that is limiting their freedom, but it's a good limiting of their freedom. It's like I don't support I'm not forcing the word freedom to be like good in every context. Like, if you're telling people you have to put on a mask, that is limiting their freedom the way I would define it. But it's a good limiting of their freedom. It's a time where that's good, in my opinion.
But Michael, I think that's your point of view. You ask a person like who does not want to wear a mask, they will cite you like 10 different citations, data, scientific facts about the inefficacy of masks. And so from their viewpoint, it's like, yeah, you're restricting my freedom, you know.
Yeah.
But the question comes up, does that person have the right to infect other people
Well, the question
by not wearing a mask?
I think we're coming up, I think this is more than semantics. I mean, freedom, if we believe that freedom, the fundamental meaning implies a balance, we're having a disagreement about what's required. And here we're having two different sides where, you know, we have another group that says, you know, it's your choice to leave the home and interact with individuals. And if they happen to not be wearing a mask, is that the risk that you take? Who is responsible for bearing the risk when it comes out of going outside? And you have the freedom to leave your home, but you may encounter some risks. And if one of those risks happens to be someone who is infected with COVID out in the world, and you decide to place yourself in an environment with someone like that, you know, if whether or not they're required to wear a mask is, you know, kind of your own choosing. And I think that's the one difference in terms of interpretation of what freedom means. Where if you're going to advocate for someone on the other side, they might say, you know, freedom indicates, you know, that I can choose to wear whatever and go places, and there's always going to be a risk associated with leaving your home.
Right. And I think like there are bars, like for example, here in Minneapolis, who still have dance parties. Okay, they are known COVID hotspots, and yet people throng to those establishments, unless and until, of course, like the government is saying, okay, you can't do this anymore, all right? And that's their own choice. Like they are saying, okay, they're willing to take that risk and be in that kind of an establishment. So in that sense, like, yeah, you know.
Who's the football player that said, if I die, I die? You know, that's like, I mean, and the thing is, whether or not, you know, you're infecting other people or not is, you know, a question of debate and science and philosophy, in some sense differing, you know, risk weighing. But I think in both cases, we're having a fundamental disagreement about, you know, freedom and the balance of freedom. And that's what I think we're seeing. It's more than just semantics. We're talking about a fundamental understanding of what does it mean to be free.
So I think like it becomes like more important to like for a democracy to start embracing scientific facts. And as long as like those scientific facts are not tainted by politics and can be credible, I think you will have vast swaths of humanity in this country wearing masks, you know. But once like you start politicizing it, there is always this hanging question, then you know you lose. Then you have all these 50,000 YouTube videos which will have isolated anecdotes countering anything scientific, you know. And then you will have a certain segment of the population which will say, yeah, I don't want to wear masks, they're not efficacious, that's stupid, I should be free, I should be allowed to, you know, be mask free. So that's a conundrum, you know, we're facing in this country right now.
Right. And I think there is something to be said about, you know, personal freedom in the moment versus long term. There, I mean, we're talking about, you know, a balance that goes beyond the moment. And I can see, you know, a difference in talking about, you know, going to a social setting and not wearing a mask, where you're going to be interacting with other people who I guess don't really care about COVID. And then, you know, going to your own place of residence where you're really not interacting with people. And I'll be the first to say that I'm like a pretty big quarantiner. Like I will stay in my apartment and not leave for a long time. But I know there are individuals out there that have a different philosophy. And what I've heard for the most part is, well, you know, you don't live in a vacuum, right? You're going to be interacting with other people. So to say that you don't want to wear a mask just because of a fashion statement in terms of that being what it really means to be free, I don't know if that's really what we're talking about here. But if we're saying you have to wear a mask, even if there is really no risk of spreading it to someone who's A, at risk, or B, someone who's not going to, consent to that, that does make you kind of question that risk analysis a little bit, right? Maybe I'm wrong here. I want to hear someone kind of another thought.
I just want to welcome Sashir and kind of little recap, Sashir. So we're continuing last week's discussion about freedom. What is freedom, different kinds of freedom, and specific example, obviously the mask example. And I think that's a great example. I think Ellison brought it up, or someone else brought it up, but Ellison brought up actually Michael brought up, I think, or David, the example of the mask. But Ellison was talking about, I think that's a good point, the balance that freedom implies. So, and the mask example really highlights that very nicely. Yeah, what kind of, when does your freedom start or end, and how does the mask situation relates to that? So that's kind of just a fast recap. So Sashir is up to date. What do you think, Sashir?
Well, this has been an argument that's been going on for quite a while. I mean, this isn't freedom saying I choose not to wear a mask. One, if you're not wearing a mask because you don't believe that COVID is real or it's fake, well, that's ignorance. I mean, that's not freedom. That's just ignorance out of it. But even
right,
if
we're operating under the principle that if someone who says I'm not going to wear a mask because it's my right for freedom, kind of operating under the principle that it does exist.
Right, but that goes back to your right to your fist ends at the right to my nose. I mean, this has been a long established concept that freedom does not imply you do whatever you want, and no matter whatever the results are to anybody else. It's always bound within a social structure. There's no such thing as freedom without a social structure behind it.
Right. And I think that's the piece, like there's no such thing, I think, as unbridled freedom. And maybe correct me if you guys think that that's incorrect. I think, fundamentally, there has to be some boundaries and balance and things like that when we're talking about what does it mean to be free.
Now, one thing I think is interesting is when you're only putting yourself at risk versus when you're putting other people at risk. So when you put other people at risk, the laws are much more stringent, obviously. Like for example, there's no law really saying that you can't do some crazy extreme sports stunt, or that you can't try to climb a mountain without having a rope supporting you. There's very few laws around that, but traffic laws there's a lot of those because you're putting other people at risk. So it's kind of interesting. How much of a difference should there be in laws when you're putting yourself at risk versus when you're potentially putting other people at risk?
Aren't you always putting yourself, like other people at risk? Like even if you go skydiving, the risk that your parachute does not inflate and that you fall on an unsuspecting person down below. I mean, you always have this, potentially incidental risk of harming others, right? But you have to.
Not to mention the risk to your parents' emotional well-being if you should die.
Right.
You're harming a lot of people who love you.
Yeah.
Should we tell people they can't go skydiving? So I mean.
Well, another example of freedom in the same, it's very different, but it's also very political or very politicized type of freedom. Abortion, right? Do you have the freedom to do what you want to do to your own body, or are you infringing on someone else's freedom when you commit an act of abortion?
I think abortion should be
also
scientifically based.
I'm sorry?
I think it should be scientifically based. But I don't know.
Like, is the fetus alive at early conscious?
Fetus and its consciousness,
Right. It all comes down to
what is consciousness.
And then we can talk about what is.
If you answer that question, you win a Nobel Prize.
Yeah, I think David has a great point there. I mean, if it's scientifically based in that case, I mean, that leaves us kind of in a, yeah, that one is difficult to solve, Rupinder, with science.
Yeah, I know Ben Shapiro.
Science can help, but maybe it's not a perfect answer, but science can help, you know? Like, is it
Science definitely can help, but I think we're talking about a philosophical question, which is great, right? Like let's imagine science can help. What would you expect the science, like what types of things would you want the science to tell us?
Yeah, this kind of ties into the mind-body problem that we talked about a while back. Like, can you physically detect the presence of consciousness?
No.
Yeah, I open a can of worms because the
Yeah.
abortion case, I mean, it's a terrible case. Like, I don't know why I even
Well,
talked about it because
now
it's
let
so
me do this.
complicated.
Let me tell you some things I think, and then let the debate ensue. Okay.
Sounds good. We're here for a while, so let's. Who cares? Yeah.
When I hear people say that I'm pro-life and I believe life begins at conception and that kind of thing, I usually, try to indicate that I think life began about 4 billion years ago and it never stopped. Most cells die. It just in the natural course of events, most cells die. On the other hand, in some sense, I am pro-choice, but I think the choice needs to be made in the first 6 months. But I don't
Wait
think.
a second, David. I think someone has like there's something in the background. We can't really hear you because.
I don't know what that is.
Are there like children in the background somewhere?
Yeah.
That's a good point. Like the pro-choice side, that there's also kind of a spectrum there.
Carolyn, do you have like some children there with you?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Can you just, when you're not talking, please just mute because we can hear them pretty loudly.
Okay.
Okay, I think it's good now, David.
No, what I was saying is that late-term abortions, I have a problem with that. If the baby is viable, I have a problem with that. Yep. And so, but I'm not entirely. I think a woman should be able to decide whether or not they want another being to invade their body, and if it's early on, I think they should be able to stop it. That's just what I think. So let the debate ensue.
Yeah, I think that's kind of a case of personal freedom because it's really tied very closely, like you said, to someone's body. I mean, it's something that is going to grow in your belly and it's going to have to come out in a pretty traumatic way. I mean, there's definitely a very strong connection with what you can do or what you cannot do with your body. So
when does this fetus have rights? I mean, some people, that's the question, right?
That's the question, yeah.
When does that, individual have its own freedom and agency?
I don't think a group of cells has rights.
So the courts currently, the defining feature, and this is always, the mark is moving because of science, obviously, but it's viability, whether or not that group of cells can survive without the mother. And as science gets better and better, we're seeing the ability for that fetus to survive without the mother at a very, very early age. So, or like at a very early state. So if we can pull those group of cells out and have them supported in most oftentimes by machines.
And I think right now the threshold is about 6 or 7 months. That someone can be born premature as early as 7 months and still live.
We're seeing it even earlier, and I'm not the best person to be talking about this.
Yeah, I'm not either.
No, Sarah was on another call, but I know she is works as a nurse, but they're talking about being able to, during the abortion process, very early on, take a very small fetus, and through the technology of being able to support life through kind of machines and things like that, being able to incubate a fetus and bring this child into a life of its own without the mother, through like essentially state funding and through these machines that we have, that like instead of aborting someone who might actually be a person, it's actually, we have the capability to allow that individual the right to live. And that's a really interesting question here. We're talking about, when does someone have rights? And I mean, I don't know, but also women, the ability to choose at what time period too. I mean, right now we have birth control, readily available more than we ever have before. It's easier to get, than it ever has before. Lo and behold, accidents happen, unplanned pregnancies happen. What do we do then? And what is the responsibility of, the mother in the family unit versus, now something that has a potential for life, right? And when that potentiality for life has its own rights and freedom and the right to live unrestricted, because that is a very, very difficult question that the courts will be looking at in the next, coming years.
But
Well, according to the Constitution, I mean, rights are granted at birth. I mean, it says that specifically in the 14th Amendment. But in terms of personhood, we're all over the place because we do have situations where if you kill a pregnant woman, you can be tried for double murder.
When we're talking about, I mean, just to clarify, birth rights, when you become a citizen, you have certain rights underneath, the US Constitution, those types of things. But the right to live is a fundamental right that you have before birth. I mean, when you're at 8 months and you're not born yet, you have, that's the consideration is that you're, going to be protected in that sense. So that's why, no one really, I mean, we can debate this in some, philosophical debate for sure. But I think most people would probably argue that, an 8-month, child who's in the womb is, across the board is not to be aborted. But
Right.
Well, it's not just the right to citizenship. If I remember the Constitution correctly, it's equal protection applies to people who are born.
right, but it's a more, the bar is higher, right, for the rights that you get once you're born and you're now born on US soil and those types of things. Like, but we're talking about just at a bare minimum, the right to not be aborted and killed, right? I mean, it's we're talking about a very low bar here, right?
But if you're talking about like the probability that the fetus is going to live, then where does that right kick in? Because theoretically, you can make an argument that it kicks in 7 days after conceiving, or 10 days after conceiving, or a month after conceiving. So you can have like all these different time factorums.
Yeah, I think whatever the line we choose is would be somewhat arbitrary. Like whatever line we choose, they'd say, well, why couldn't it be a day later? Why couldn't it be a day earlier? So we kind of just have to use our own sort of feelings in a way, or just sort of human consensus to just pick a line and say that's the line, in my opinion.
Yeah, I
And-
agree. It's
Yeah.
I'm not persuaded that we can reach a consensus about.
Yeah, consensus is it's not a good word, but yeah. I
Yeah,
don't
and
know.
the courts have agreed. I mean, they say it's a really hard question.
It is a hard question. So what happens like if scientifically, within the first 1 month, you come to know that the baby has some genetic defect? Like maybe it's Down syndrome, maybe it's like whatever be the reasons, and the mother or the father does not want the child to come to life because of that, because they feel that it's going to be too much. It's going to be too much stress and strain and this and that. Do you think that's okay?
well, that's a moral question, right? I mean, that's clearly,
Yes.
yeah, we're clearly going into the territory, which is fine, but that's clearly a moral question. Like it's going to depend on your principles,
I do recognize that, yes.
right?
Well, if we're
Because-
talking about purely for freedom, though, wouldn't we want that individual to make the choice? If this individual will have some sort of capacity, whatever that means, that capacity, for freedom, wouldn't we want the individual to make that choice whether or not they want to be a participant in the world versus the parents? Or, I mean, that's a question of freedom, but also ethics too.
Now, I would like to be there on the day that somebody is born and the doctor asks the question, do you want to be part of this world?
Yeah,
Or
that
not.
didn't happen when my daughter was born. That wasn't that long ago. That was only 4 months ago, and I guarantee that doesn't happen.
She'll
If
have
I
those
knew-
questions like
if
in her
I knew
early
then
20s.
what I knew now, I would say no way.
I know. We can have those questions later and say, gosh, did I really have a choice to be here
Yeah.
or not? Because maybe I would have chosen something else.
Yeah.
Well, I'm still hung up on this question of right, and this question of the right to life. I mean, this is it's not actually enumerated right. It's kind of this tenuous, nebulous right. But we are granting the question of personhood to a fetus.
I understand what you're saying, Sheer, but allow me to give you my perspective on rights. When the people who founded this country, the founding fathers, when they were developing and voting on the Declaration of Independence, they were not just declaring independence from Britain. They knew they were declaring war. And it was the first time in history that human beings said the only just form of government is definitely not a monarchy. And they were saying they did not define our rights. They didn't grant us rights. What they did, the true genius, was that they said our rights are inalienable, and it's the responsibility of the government to protect them. That's my view. It's also my view. When I was younger, I used to hear the rule of law, and I thought that meant people who make the laws rule over me, but they don't. The rule of law is rules for the government, not for the citizens. I mean, we have rules too, but in my view, our rights are not given to us by the government. They are recognized as inalienable or unalienable, whatever you choose.
Right. That was the Jeffersonian view. And I don't want to get us sidetracked in a long discussion about constitutional history, but needless to say, then the constitutional debate, because originally they weren't going to have a Bill of Rights. They didn't think it was needed. That did end up becoming a subject of debate. That said,
no, some did. That's why we have one.
Right, but that said,
Madison always thought we needed a Bill of Rights.
Whether government grants rights or they're inalienable, we're still talking about whether a fetus has personhood. Because would you argue then that just my
correct.
thumb has
That's
rights?
Correct. All I was trying to do was offer you some of my perspective on what our rights are and where they come from.
Right, but that's still starting the issue, because then that would be a default position of saying then we're just going to say fetuses have personhood. But that does open the question then, what is personhood? And if we're just talking about it's just a right to life,
I think
rights don't apply.
Sorry. I think Michael is right, man. I think that we just can't agree on something like that. I mean, I think it's impossible, right? Not even with the science, the science can't tell us everything. In the case of abortion, I mean, that's very clear that it doesn't give us a clear cut answer. And in some cases, we just have to agree on something that we all agree on, and that can be, in Roman law, someone was not a person until that person was born. Until he or she was born, you were just nothing. I mean, you were a fetus, but you weren't a person. You didn't have the rights that belong to a person, including the right to live. I think that's the right way to go, because that's a pretty, like, if anything else, it's clear cut, right? Not person, person, not person, person. It's very, very, very clear. If we go into like Christian doctrine and especially these days, I mean, who knows? Yeah, I guess it starts with conception. You know, it starts with conception. If there's a little seed there, yeah, okay, that's a baby, even though it's not. But you know, it is what it is. That's what they think, and then we can go into all kinds of legal determinations by all kinds of legal systems, like you know, Ireland, the UK, the United States, Brazil, Japan. All of them have probably a somewhat different interpretation of when it's okay to abort or not, and usually influenced by their juridical tradition, and especially by their religious tradition. But I mean, there's no one answer, right? There's clearly no one answer. So there's not a clear cut answer, no matter what we do, and the science can't really tell us either. So we just have to agree on something.
Well, if I could bring this back to freedom, I think the abortion debate is really less about a question of the right to life or whether fetuses are persons, and more about a question of whether this particular action should be criminalized. I think it's a moral argument to say that abortion is wrong for whatever reason, and I'm playing devil's advocate by quoting the
well, people like to say
abortion
abortion is
side.
wrong because that's a Christian perspective, and Christians like to think in terms of good or bad.
Right, but that's why I'm saying it's an argument about criminalizing the action. And then so this is the question of freedom from the point of the woman carrying the term, is whether she has autonomy over her body, and that would be bodily freedom, versus whether saying that we can criminalize the action of abortion, which directly affects her body.
I disagree. I really
person.
disagree with that definition, because I think it has nothing to do with criminalization. I think it has everything to do with the concept of freedoms and what it means to be balance those freedoms. And I think that, again, it's the mother's right versus
Allison, bring it back to freedom. Bring it back to the balance. That was the whole
back
point.
to and Frank, you're joining the discussion. Today's topic is freedom. I know you guys talked about it last time. I wasn't there. We're starting with a working definition of what does it mean to be fundamentally free. And you know, I know you might pick this apart, but we're starting with a working.
I'm gonna just try to stay quiet as long as possible this time. Just go nuts.
Ooh. No, I'm kidding. But I do think that, like, we started out talking about mask wearing, we moved on to abortion, but one of the things that we talked about is there's levels of freedom. You'll like this, you know, Hegel talked about there being, like, you know, different definitions of the soul, individual, you know, societal, political, the world soul, versus, and likewise, there's like different levels of freedom. There's individual freedom, you know, social group freedom, political freedom, those types of things. But one of the things that we were talking about is a fundamental characteristic of freedom is that there's really no such thing as unbridled freedom. That freedom is always sort of a balance where, you know, you have to weigh, you know, there's no such thing as freedom in a vacuum, at least nothing that we can really think of. So it's always, you know, at what level does it impinge on someone else's freedom when you choose to, you know, act in a certain way. And there's some really difficult cases. Obviously, mask wearing has been a big one. Abortion's been a really big one. And I guess one of the questions I was going to turn, just to pivot the conversation, is whether or not you guys think people might have different capacities to be free. And one of the things, you know, you've heard of, like, the IQ test, the newly fashioned EQ test for emotional quotient. Is there some sort of freedom quotient, an FQ test with, you know, the ability to be free? And I'm going to pitch it with, you know, if you're born and, you know, into a family where you may not have, you know, maybe you have a disability, for example, and you may not have the capacity to make decisions about your life, because of maybe, you know, some capacity issues. Maybe it's the fact that you're a young person. Maybe it's the fact that you're living in a certain environment that's very authoritative. Could you have
Allison, help me out. Capacity, expand on capacity. Capacity to be free, to understand what freedom is, to capacity to do math. I don't know what you mean.
That's a good question. So I think unlike, pure ability, I mean, freedom in some sense it's an action-based type of a thing, right? That's why we're seeing a balance of freedom, because freedom implies the ability to act in a certain way. And that's why you have, some tension there, because you cannot act in a vacuum. And that's why every action you may run into another person trying to act a different way. I mean,
okay,
sure, yeah.
And help me separate this from George Orwell. In other words, how do you go about determining someone's capacity for something, for freedom? Or are you saying that the amount of freedom that a person has should be based on their capacity for understanding it?
It might play a factor. I'm really trying to define what the factors might be, because I don't think that freedom is necessarily something that or capacity to be free is something you're necessarily born with. Like if we're going to a 1984 situation where everybody's kind of being watched all the time on lockdown, maybe that environment in itself says, hey, this group of people, this individual's freedom, FQ or whatever might be a little bit lower because of the environment they're placed in. So I'm not to say that you're born with a particular,
But I guess what I'm driving at is should we try to make laws or governance based that apply differently to people based on their capacity?
I think to some extent we do, because we require kids to go to school. Now, what if the kid says, well, I don't want to go to school. I think school's dumb. Well, we say they're too young to make that decision, right? They don't. So age is one way in which we do that. I guess the question is, should we do it in other ways? Another example is, let's say you have a parent that has Alzheimer's, and so you're their legal guardian. Then by law, you get to make decisions for them because they don't have the capacity to do it. So I guess the question is, what's the scope of that? What should be the scope of that?
Are we here defining freedom, or are we defining personhood?
Freedom, that's the main.
Well, no, I mean, when Michael brought up the area that a kid can make a decision for itself, or someone with Alzheimer's, or a person, that usually when we define personhood, agency is implied in that area. So just to clarify, are we saying that freedom and with capacity, that freedom and personhood are getting tangled together? Or
I would say that personhood, and I'll just jump in here, but personhood is a different question, right? We're not saying children are not persons, or elderly are not persons. I think have to be, I don't even know if you have to be a person to have freedom. I feel like that's another discussion, but the idea of being a free agent and having the ability not just to understand, but to act in a manner that's truly free. I'm trying to figure out where that line kind of comes in play. And there seems to be some things that we're touching on, like children, individuals with Alzheimer's, those types of things.
Yeah, I think Michael really helped you out, Allison, because he made it very clear. So yeah, there's absolutely no doubt. Well, no, it's true. You gave us perfect examples, because I think you reinforced Allison's point that she was trying to make. Not everybody has the same ability to be free, to make free choices. A kid does not have the same ability as a grown-up to be free, to determine the course of his own or her own life. And the same goes for people that are mentally disabled, for really old people that have lost their faculties. So I think that, that proves, Allison, that yes, there is absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt, different levels of capacity in terms of freedom. I mean, does that apply to your regular adult population without any mental disabilities? I mean, that is unclear.
Two
What I
30-year-old.
what I will say though, and then after that, you can say it, David, but what I do think is clear is that people with different cultural backgrounds might have different capacities to understand and to exercise their freedom. So American society, for example, is a society that gives freedom a lot of importance, and you see that with the whole mask thing, regardless of if it's reasonable or not. I believe it's not, but just the fact that there is a debate tells you, okay, people have a problem with just doing whatever the government tells them to do. You look at Japan or China, that's not even a debate. I mean, that's really not a debate. They're telling you to wear a mask because you might contaminate other people, because there's this virus going around. You wear the mask. It's not even a debate, right? But that also reflects something that is very fundamental about those societies and very fundamental about those cultures and about those individuals culturally in how they perceive freedom and in how they exercise freedom. Like Americans or Westerners in general are used to making their own decisions, to living life with a lot of choices and assuming that they have the choice to do a bunch of things. People in China, I mean, that's a different deal, right? And they are born into a different society where freedom is not a given. They grow up without exercising that freedom. Of course, their freedom IQ, like I don't know, this might not be a good way to put it, but their ability to exercise freedom is not the same. Maybe it's something that we just need to practice. I don't know.
I think like maybe it will help to kind of like distinguish between different types of freedom clearly, because you have something like economic freedom, you have political freedom, a societal freedom, based upon where you're living, the country you're living in, the city you're living in, the state you're living in. So all those factors come into play. But I think I was more curious about your individual consciousness. Like, okay, individually, like banning all these other extraneous freedoms, like human beings, like we always long for something more than what may be physically possible within ourselves. And that's a human longing. That's a longing which I think every human being has. And how to kind of like define that, like.
I think that's interesting. And I think it kind of ties back to what I was talking about freedom being a state of mind versus meaning that you can physically do what you want. And an interesting example is if you look at people in solitary confinement, for example, they leave solitary confinement, but mentally they're still kind of in prison, right? It's like mentally and spiritually, it's like they're still kind of in a bubble, and that takes time to sort of break out of.
Yeah, like for example, Bruno was talking about China and Bhutan and Burma. I mean, but then you can look at the monks over there. Like to them, like they will say, "Yeah, we are free." They are embodiment of freedom,
Yeah, so that's the reverse situation where physically you are really limited, but internally you feel free. So maybe you're like a worker in a warehouse that has to shelve boxes 12 hours a day, but maybe mentally you feel free because, I don't know, maybe you're coming up with music in your head or you're just thinking of new ideas.
Maybe we just can't individually in our consciousness imagine that freedom. Maybe it's unimaginable. But we know that, like, okay, there are always these kind of like limitations or ropes we have, maybe I'm addicted to something, maybe I am attached to something. And can I cut these ropes one at a time? And will that make me free? Possibly. and then you maybe you can find more of those rope attachments, and then more and more and more.
And Rupinder, when you're saying cutting the ropes, you mean from a mental, emotional state?
Correct. Like, someone who's an addict, he's not free because he's the alcohol is grabbing him.
He's got a low FQ.
Say it again.
He has a low freedom quotient.
He may have a low freedom quotient. Yeah. Maybe you're
Right.
with someone, maybe it's the love of your life, maybe it's your kid, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's any relationship you may have,
So I like the path that we're going down here because this flies in my original kind of definition, flies in the face of when I said that freedom seems to imply action. That, that's what we come into, an argument between people who don't want to wear masks or things like that. And obviously there are some things that do require action, but a lot of, if we just focus on the fact that maybe freedom could potentially be, a mental state, that's an interesting thing to think, the idea of being resentful for having to, behave in a particular way is in itself its own shackles.
Exactly. Like, I'm angry at someone, or I am so angry that it consumes me. That's limiting my freedom.
Right, but
Yeah.
this makes freedom very relativistic. I mean, if we're talking about mental freedom, again, you could say that someone in prison is free. I
Could
mean,
be.
that was the Viktor Frankl argument that he could.
Not everyone in the prison would be free, but maybe there are some who are,
Right, but this gets back. You could make in fact, I think Orwell makes the argument that actually you are free under the state of Oceania because you don't have to worry about anything. Therefore, you are free. I mean, and the communism makes the argument.
That brings a very interesting theory. Like, say if the government was to ensure your health insurance, ensure you're fed, like you can get like 2 meals or 3 meals a day. Will that make a larger portion of the society to be more free, where they can really extend themselves because now they are not encumbered by the daily gringe of life, which is like, oh, I have to get 2 meals on my dinner, and then I have to have a home to live. And if some of those things were just taken care of, like would that make a society more free?
Well, I think that's a great point, Rupinder, and that reminds me when I spent some time in Croatia, I met a lot of people that had lived under communism, and I remember talking to someone, and he told me, well, there are good things about society now. There's more political freedom and all that, but he kind of missed the old days of communism, in which he wasn't so concerned about money all the time, and like you said, getting those basic things, like constantly those meals and finding out the money to pay rent and all that. And I'm not saying that, I'm not making any judgment here.
But part of
something that he said, but it is a good point, and I think it does highlight the fact that there are different kinds of freedom, right? If I were to make a judgment of value, I would say, well, ideally, we would live in a world that has, or that gives us that political freedom, and that gives us that social freedom and that personal freedom, and also that economic freedom. Because yes, it is true that if you're concerned about, making ends meet constantly, and that's the only thing you can think about, that's not true freedom in life. In fact, in a lot of democracies, including I think the American one in the beginning, a reason why people, the only true citizens, the people that voted and determined the course of the country, they were deemed, they had to be landowners, or they had to have some sort of property, some sort of status, economic status, because they thought, and this goes back to the Romans and Greeks as well, you can't have someone who's concerned with making ends meet. You can't expect that person to actually have the capacity to also determine the course of the republic. those people don't have the same kind of freedom.
I don't know if that was that really the foundation of American freedom. 'Cause
I
when
think that was
about-
I think that was one of the considerations that
Right. Yes. The original voting, you had to be a white male landowner.
Right, but the intent behind that, I mean, I understand from the Greek standpoint, when you look at the Republic, that makes sense. When you look at, the US, you look to the Lockean kind of what is freedom, the right to pursue happiness, whatever that might mean. I mean, I think we were at least touching on this concept of limited resources. And maybe that's an interesting, and I don't know, David's kind of raising his eyebrows, so it's you can jump in here. But I mean, can you be, when we're talking about freedom, pursuing, life, that's makes sense. Pursuing property is going to be more difficult because we have limited amounts of property. Pursuing happiness, I don't really know what that means, but I think a lot of when we think of it from a Lockean standpoint, it ties into this concept of.
Are we doing Locke or are we doing Jefferson? Are we doing life, liberty, property, or life, liberty, in the pursuit of happiness?
Well, right. Jefferson dropped property just because he
No
realized.
one said property is all right. So.
I think the happiness was just made up by the people that wrote the Constitution, right? I think it had never shown up in any constitutional documents ever.
It was a
It's not even
compromise.
in the Constitution. That's
It was a compromise.
Yeah. It was Jefferson pretty much saying, I'm plagiarizing, but I don't want people to know I'm plagiarizing,
The old college try.
well. There was also a debate about to what extent then would government have to guarantee.
Oh, read a second treatise of government and read any of the works of Jefferson. It's like, dude, you just ripped whole sections out of here.
All
Oh,
right.
he did. Yeah, but
Go
Jefferson
ahead,
acknowledged
David.
that.
We're digressing.
Let me just throw something in here. In this conversation, two roads have diverged.
hmm
On the one hand, we're talking about encumbrances, burdens that a person may have. And on the other hand, we're talking about how the government should treat people, how it should be designed. Is that what we're talking about? Are we going down those two roads at the same time?
Well, I think the problem is we've made freedom relativistic. I mean, and the Buddhist ideal would be the state of nirvana is a state of ultimate freedom because it's a state of non-being. It's a state of no attachment. But I don't think that's for practical discussion, especially political discussion.
I
qualifies
understand
freedom.
that. I understand that, Shashir, and you're correct. I guess what I'm trying to figure out, I'm trying to throw a rope around this conversation so that I know how to contribute, but the roads diverge wider and wider.
I don't know everything.
And I'm not
heard-
able to throw a rope around it.
Yeah, no, I mean it's if someone wants to try to kind of like bring it all together, but I think there is in any conversation that is open-ended about freedom, I mean you are going to have different kinds of freedom, and they're different things. They're different things, and that's why I think we're talking about different things, but
We can tie the two together. So whenever you have government free people from encumbrances, essentially it comes out of your tax dollars. So they're taking your money and deciding what to do with it. So I think the two kind of go hand in hand a little bit because freedom from encumbrance, somebody's got to be implementing that, and whoever's doing that is using your resources to do it.
Well, I just took it as a basis that we were trying to discuss freedom, and it took a turn where we said freedom, I believe, Michael, you brought it up, freedom is essentially of the mind. And
That's-
then
yeah,
Allison
I totally
was
believe that.
Allison was basically discussing a freedom capacity, and a freedom capacity, as I understood, she talked about it, had to do with the environment, somewhat the environment or time that you are a part of, how we categorize your freedom. Which is to say, we always use the prisoner example. The person may be in jail, may say they're free, but if they could be free in another environment, would they take that, or in some other way? Or does a person in a different environment have more of a potential to freedom? And then Rupender, Shashir,
Yeah.
we got talking about China, with Bruno also brought up, and just saying that people in China may have a different understanding of freedom from what people in the West do, just based on their societal aims. I'm sorry, David. I'm trying to recap everything, and
Yeah,
I'm trying to rope it. I'm
still whirling this rope around.
All right. So let's put it this way, okay? Well, and there are two different ways of talking about freedom. Also, that complicates things, and we're a lot of people and we're philosophers, so we just like to talk about stuff, But look, we can talk about freedom, trying to understand what freedom is, trying to define it. So that's something that we were doing. But we another way to talk about freedom is like what is desirable concerning freedom, right? And that's kind of a different conversation. So let's go that route for a little bit, just to see where it leads us. What is desirable? So what kind of freedom, or what sort of amount of freedom do we truly desire as individuals or as societies, which is a problem because those are also two different things. But, what do we desire in terms of freedom, be that social, personal, political, economic? I mean, we live in the United States, so I assume everybody kind of values their freedom, but I don't know. You guys tell me. I mean, personally, I think freedom is very important. Freedom is very important to me. But I think freedom is not just social and political and personal. I think freedom is also economic. And I think that's a very important part of it as well.
Well, if you think about, again, the Declaration of Independence of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, in many ways, liberty and the pursuit of happiness kind of put together, kind of define kind of freedom, at least as envisioned by Jefferson. But if I think about liberty in terms of, since Locke has been brought up, in terms of what Locke described it, in terms of having this agency to do action within my own interest, so bound in it. But that obviously leads to pursuit of happiness. If I have the freedom to decide that I want to go out and get a hot dog because that would make me happy, that's pursuit of happiness. My ability to go get it is bound up in the freedom to be able to go have a hot dog than rather somebody saying, no, you have to eat, a slice of pizza instead.
But then I would pose the question, you're going out to get the hot dog, but are you going out to get the hot dog because you want it, or because you've sat in front of the TV and been bombarded with hot dog ads all day? Is that your actual desire?
Well, that's a question of personal agency, but I would say
no, that to me very
That's
much
a question of freedom.
That is freedom.
But in terms of political freedom, though, I don't know if that matters. It's just whether it makes me happy.
He's gonna get a bees, and he's gonna get like healthcare, and then like it'll affect my taxes.
I mean, does getting the hot dog make me happy or not? Whether someone suggested it to
Does
me
it
or
make
whether
you
it's
free?
again.
Are you getting that Are you getting that hot dog because you want that hot dog, or are you getting that hot dog because someone else wants you to get that hot dog?
Or are you getting that hot dog because
this is the argument? This is it right here.
But what does it matter if the end result is
saying you don't know what you want, Shashir.
right? But what does it matter whether if the end result makes me happy?
I think that's the real piece, that if you feel like you're choosing, even if you are like, as a human, as dumb as we are, as hardwired as we are to like see a hot dog ad, and some people, they're so easy, they see the hot dog ad, they don't even realize it. They're walking to the store with like $1 in their pocket and they're going to buy a hot dog. And like, they feel like they have this freedom of choice. And that feels good. Is that enough? I mean, or do we think, we talk about like these people who are quote unquote enlightened, who are people who can forego these like worldly possessions, and are they better than us? Are they freer than us? I don't know. Are they happier than us?
Right. We don't know. I mean, that gets into a relativistic argument about At
It's
that-
not relativistic. It can actually be expressed. So
We would have to have one
But
of
yes,
those
if it's-
people
if it
come
makes me happy,
here and
it
talk to
makes
us.
me happy. That's
no, 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 no,
Who do
no,
you
no.
know?
exercise of liberty.
But here's the thing with the hot dog. If you're going to get the hot dog, or if you're not getting the hot dog, if I came up to you and I asked you, you know, we already talked about this when I talked about explaining the rigor of being libertarian with my cousin. If I came up to you and said, "Why did you get the hot dog?" Asked you to express why you got hot dog, you know, if it's the ad, are you going to be able to express that I did this and convince me that it was of your agency? Or are we just going to work ourselves back to the
It
ad?
affects their FQ, their freedom
So-
quotient.
Yeah,
Okay.
Allison, when you come up with a test for the FQ, I want to know what it is.
I know that's the problem. Right?
Right, but if we're talking about the pursuit of happiness in terms of agency, yes, you're right. Whether I have agency or not to get the hot dog, but that agency could be constrained by.
I love this hot dog.
So
Yeah, it could just. I just like hot dog.
I'm a little bit confused about the hot dog. What?
Let me,
Go ahead.
let me complicate it further. Share, you get a hot dog and it makes me happy. I
Okay.
mean, I have enjoyed my share of hot dogs.
And ketchup, or is
But
it
in
with
terms of freedom and happiness, the pursuit of happiness, what about the pig?
Mm.
Well, does a pig have rights? It's the
Well,
pig. Are we great?
I-
The pig
I-
personhood.
I don't
Point,
think I don't
the
I
dog.
don't think animals have the same rights that humans, but
No,
life should be one.
should it?
That's well, that's a good point. Then we'd have to get back to the argument of if we're granting personhood or
Bruno,
rights at that point.
Bruno,
No,
you wanted
No,
to say
no,
something?
we're not. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about, do animals have the right to live?
Yeah, you're granting them rights.
Today's
I'm not
today's world,
granting them
no.
right. I'm saying, do they have that right by default, whether I grant it
Got a
or
low freedom quotient.
not? Yes.
I would call it, I would just say, you know, I would say no, just from observing what's going around me. You know, I ate a hamburger tonight, so who the hell am I to talk about? But you know, the reason we think we have, you know, life is probably, you know, as a given thing, is we've been convinced that life is a given freedom to us. We've been convinced of it. You know, it's not that it's, I mean, oh, I should stop talking. This is going to get bad.
No, we
You know, Frank,
presume
there
because
was-
we're here, we exist. So therefore, life.
Well,
There was-
let me
intrinsic
let me
value.
Go,
Let me put-
someone digress.
I
Let
want
me
to go
put it
back to
this
Frank's
way.
point.
let me put it this way: Are we free? Just so we can advance the conversation a little bit. I didn't really understand the hot dog thing. I mean, what
Okay,
what is
I
it?
would say.
Anyways, are we free right now? As we
A
are
hot-
talking about freedom, I
It
mean,
depends on whether or not you're one with everything.
I want a hot dog.
I like that.
Really
But
evolved.
in many ways, I don't think we are. So this kind
I
of
would say
goes
we're
back-
not because we're all on a Zoom.
I can
Hold
tell
on,
you.
hold on. What, Michael?
let's try to go one at a time. I can't really understand
No,
anything.
Sorry.
Okay, so I was going to bring up an economist. I read this article and he brought up: do we have the right to not be interrupted? So, for example, like or attention to be interrupted. So, for example, let's say someone's standing outside a store waving a sign, "Buy this hot dog, buy this hot dog," right? You didn't want to see that really. You probably would have rather just not seen it and driven right by. But the fact that that person is waving that sign and takes your attention away, it's kind of like they're infringing upon your sort of right to not have your attention be interrupted. So should we?
Oh God.
I don't think people have the right not to be insulted.
Oh, not insulted.
Even interrupt
Their
or attention.
to be interrupted.
I don't think people have that right.
Yeah.
And
So
and
like,
the example I give is 2 or 3 years ago, a couple of gay businessmen had a meeting with Ted Cruz, who has been homophobic to the max. And the gay community described the two businessmen as Nazi collaborators. Okay. All right. Just because they had a talk with somebody. And if we don't talk, if we don't have conversations with people, how do we change their minds? By force? No.
Yeah, no, that's not what I'm talking about.
I think protesting and holding up a sign is what we do instead of flying planes into buildings.
Oh,
Right. I think, Michael, you're talking about essentially you're bringing up the issue Frank was bringing up, as in whether that's interrupting, kind of affecting my own agency.
Yeah.
Whether that should be nobody has the right to kind of affect my agency.
So can you
don't know if
elaborate?
I would
Can you
say it-
elaborate on that a little bit, Michael?
Yeah, I don't know if I would say it's like an absolute right. Like people could never distract you away from something you're trying to do. But I feel like today the capabilities are so much greater. Like you take your mail in your house, there's tons and tons of coupons and ads. You watch TV, there's tons and tons of ads. You go on a website, tons and tons of ads. In this age, our capability to distract people, and in particular to distract us with things we don't want, is so much greater that in today's age, should we start to introduce new rights to not be distracted to a certain extent? Maybe they can't be 100%, because that would be, like David said, we need a right to protest and whatever, but should there be some kind of right like that?
Well, and here's the thing, it's more than just the distraction, I think. I mean, we talk about the difference between, soliciting someone versus, just putting out general ads. I mean, we're seeing ads that are extremely tailored based on tons of data. I mean, the world of the Internet of Things, I mean, the amount of things that you're entering in your web browser, your computer, you've put a lot of information out there and people know what your probably personality profile is like. You're getting things that are targeted specifically for you. We're actually pretty simple when it comes down to it. I mean, most humans are. And so to be manipulated in a way by an advertiser, I would say is, restricts freedom. And I'm really proud of this group, first of all, that we haven't fallen down the rabbit hole of determinism, because I think some philosophers would totally go down that route. And I think that sticking with the illusion that we have freedom, because I think that's the important piece. It still feels like we're freely buying products that benefit us. But if it's easily attributable to an advertiser that has been targeting you because of what you do on Instagram or what you do in a web browser that doesn't have a VPN hooked up to it, I mean, that to me seems like, what type of, restriction should we have? I mean, we can't affect everything that's determined. We can't affect where you were born, who you were, what family you were born into, but we can kind of restrict and influence advertisers or individuals that might, for example, parents who are maybe a little bit more authoritative than they should be, for people who are in their 20s who are older than 18 who shouldn't live there. But if they're telling them how to live their life, I think most people are like, hey, move out, get a life, be free, feel like you're free, and I think advertisers kind of play that weird role where people are like, oh, did I end up buying this thing because someone was whispering in my ear every night? Yeah.
I like what you're saying. I like what you're saying, Allison. And a friend of mine, well, not a friend of mine, but I heard that a person printed out the end user license agreement for Candy Crush. And it was 23 pages. Now, a friend of mine recommended Ebates to me. And it was one of those rare instances where I actually read the end user license agreement because I don't always read them. Rarely do I read them, but I did read this one.
You're a rare person to have read them. I'll say that.
Well, I read it because I was suspicious. But this in one part of the contract, it says, in the agreement, it says we can change this anytime we want.
Yeah, that's pretty common, actually.
It is common for terms and conditions.
In another part of the contract, it said if we decide to change this and you continue to use the service, you have by default agreed to it. And in another part of the contract, it said we can change this contract anytime we want and we don't have to tell you.
There are
Now-
some things
Now
that
that's alarming to me.
it
And they
decreases
were spread out.
enforceable, but today that is an enforceable piece. And I do want to just remind people, like, you know what? If it's not in the contract saying that your like privacy rights are protected, or you know, if you're providing any sort of data, if it's not restricted in that agreement that you know it can't be sold to third parties, and that third party can't sell it to another third party, the default right is that companies have the right to sell your data without a restriction. So even if it doesn't say that in the contract, that is the default. So I mean, in general, it's kind of the Wild West in terms of privacy rights. And I had a friend point out that I think we're touching on privacy rights versus in freedom, but I disagree a little bit because
Well, I don't think that would stand up in a court of law. I don't think that
would.
contract would.
Well, Allison,
It
correct
would.
me.
That's very common. I do tech law today. Until courts strike that down,
There is an example of courts striking down a similar contract
Right,
it's
wasn't
probably
there a
gonna
case
be
done by a little known company called Google.
and it really depends on, number one, the type of business, what they're doing. It's always going to be fact specific. So the ability to change a contract, and this is just like informational advice only. This is not legal advice. But like at the end of the day, like it's going to be fact specific. And courts generally have not struck down terms and conditions, kind of click wrap agreements, browse agreements. They can change it when they want. It's kind of on the customer to make sure that they're keeping up to date. Most best practice companies are providing notices. You'll see like bullet point lists, you'll get an email about it, those types of things. That's for hygiene.
I'm not talking about people who are doing the right thing. I'm talking
That's
about
not,
people
the
who,
courts have said that they do not need to do that. So today, things are enforceable even if they're changed without your awareness. And as much as that seems like that's a wrong thing, until the courts have strike down as a general rule, the general rule is, yes, that is enforceable unless there's something like, for example, an arbitration clause. If somebody throws in an arbitration clause without, consent from a consumer, that's questionable because you're changing a fundamental right of pursuing a remedy. So that's a very limited holding. So in terms of, those types of things being changed, that's questionable. The general rule still is take it to court because it's a contract. And until it's been litigated, and a court has said, yep, this arbitration clause could not be changed without the consent of a consumer, the default rule is you're subject to these terms. I don't think, it's kind of, again, we can question whether that makes sense. The whole idea of a contract being a meeting of the minds doesn't seem to make a lot of sense anymore when we're talking about.
well, unless we discuss the ethics of it, we can't influence the law of it. And not to be contrary, but there is a situation where Google made a contract and an exception was made to it and it went to court and Google lost.
Right, I remember there was a case saying that they
Yeah.
have to
It's going to be very
perform
fact
changes.
specific, and it's going to be usually those rights that affect consumers in a way that's going to affect kind of a large right, whether it's to pursue remedies or they really couldn't prove that they provided any sort of hygiene in terms of notifications. I mean, it's a very fact specific analysis. There is no one general rule that you can't have clauses that say we can change this anytime, because in general you can. And so
Well, there's
But
no
they have to
general rule.
inform
You're
people.
correct. There's no general rule for that now. But I personally don't think that that would stand up in court if you had the right advocate to defend it.
I disagree. I've seen it time and time again. The general rule is if you have a contract agreement with, someone that you've agreed to, whether it's by
So
you.
if I have Clarence Darrow and you have Rudy Giuliani, you're still going to win?
Yes, we can look at Trump's case right now dealing with the elections. The courts are going to roll their eyes and they don't care what attorney you have defending a case. If it's the merits.
Yes, they do. Yes,
So
they do.
that's I do think that, sure, I would love.
It's not that the courts care. They care about the persuasiveness.
I believe we're taking a bunch of assumptions here and we've digressed very far.
Let's
from
I think
freedom.
we're in the realm of this stuff. I would love to see these contracts, be brought into question, but I don't think that we're answering the fundamental question of freedom.
No.
Well,
I diverged the road that time. Sorry.
It's okay. Let's diverge a little bit more, just because it's getting a little bit stale. Let's add fairness to it. Like,
Oh,
yeah, what is a fair society? Because we've been talking about freedom. I feel that it kind and we're kind of losing it at this point. So let's talk a little bit about fairness. Are they competitive? Or
we're getting
fairness
even more relative.
and freedom compatible? Sorry. What
is
is
fairness the same thing as equivalence?
No.
I'm not sure. No, I don't think so. What is a fair society? I don't think they're exactly.
Is fairness universal or is it like based on the geography you live in?
Society, let's say Western society. Let's say, because obviously there are very different types of society. I'm guessing. No, I mean like Western society, Western capitalist, democratic society, liberal democracy these days. Because if we're talking about China, it's a very different kind of society. But let's say, Western society in general.
Well, one concept of fairness is, let's say you haven't been born yet, and you could be born randomly into any of the 7 billion bodies on Earth, but you don't know which one. And you have to decide on the set of rules. What rules would you decide on so that if once those rules are decided, then you roll a $7 billion sided dice, you get into a random body. Those are the rules.
Rawls, right?
Yeah. John Rawls.
You're doing Veil of Ignorance.
The veil of ignorance. I think that's a good principle. Thanks for throwing that out there, Michael. I think.
Thanks for throwing that 7 billion sided die.
Big.
We've all played the lottery.
Yeah.
I have not.
Well, I think
it'd be like 100 billion sided die for the lottery, wouldn't it?
Oh yeah, at least.
Oh, it's I had a statistics teacher who once showed us it to tell us that you should never buy a lottery ticket. He actually did it in front of us, but I can't tell you the number off the top of my head.
Well, a friend of mine has a good theory why he doesn't want to buy lottery tickets, because he figures his chances are about the same winning the lottery as just finding a lottery ticket on the ground with a winning number.
I don't know.
Do you want to tell us something, Frank?
No, I just burped a little.
Oh, is that what that was?
Yeah.
Awesome.
Are there any issues with that definition of fairness? What are your guys' objections to that?
From what I understand, fairness, I've seen it expressed in multiple ways. The two most prevalent ones is, kind of what I pushed for right at the beginning is people say, well, all people are treated equally. They're all treated equal. It's all the same. And then there's another one where it's like, no, everyone kind of gets like the same starting ground, like same starting point of firing pistol to pursue their pursuit of happiness, have the same opportunity. There's other variations, but being in US, I feel like these are the two big ones that come about all the time. But yeah, that's how I understand it. I'm not going to make any preferences. I don't give a shit about preferences. That's just bias.
Well, I have a question.
Okay,
Is fairness and justice the same thing?
No.
Why not?
Justice. Well, I should qualify this correctly that I don't sound dogmatic. Justice, as I understand it, is a very much so enforced and conceptual thing that we see on data. It's litigated. It has we have oh God, courts. We have everything that is representational of justice that carries it out that we see on a day-to-day basis. People might say it's just a concept, but then I would say, well, yeah, but there's courts and there's people that practice it, and there are people who try to make it and convey it. Similar to someone might just say mathematics is just a concept. I'm like, yeah, we also have schools around that concept and people who practice it and go around. But to me, it really is just the abstraction of the laws and the process of making them and enforcing them. That's all I would say. Very Platonic, I guess.
So
Nobody
Right, would
feels
fairness
like-
also be the abstraction of the laws? I mean,
Well,
how do you
I
make
had
fairness?
two things there. I couldn't separate them.
So do you guys think we live in a fair society?
Well, it kind of depends, because I think fairness and justice are kind of like tied together. Because if you have two entities, one is, okay, just for the sake of argument, is lying, the
Mhm.
other is truthful, but the lying entity has more resources available to them to fight a battle in the court. The court, there should be like some platform where like the truth should reign and free, and that would be fair. That would be the fair thing that should be the fair outcome, Like whatever is truthful has to be the fair outcome. And if that's not the case, then that society needs some rework.
Yeah, but how many times do we watch outcomes of court trials in our society and we go, "Oh, what the hell? What the hell? What the hell is happening there?" But
So then
you study the legal precedent and the affidavits presented, and you basically go, well, understanding from what has been done in the past and the laws that were presented, yes, I understand how this could follow from this. So,
Well, would it be fair to say that a fair society is a society, or would be a society, where people have the same kinds of opportunities? Or is that what you're referring to, Rupinder? And I think maybe that's a good.
I think so. You
good
should
starting
have
point.
a set of opportunities, irrespective of your economic clout, to enable truth. And if that's not the case, then that's not a free society.
okay.
I think we can tie that back in with my definition,
Fair, equal.
which is, I think we can tie that in, which is, if you haven't been born yet, would you want to be born into a society where people have equal opportunities?
If you
So-
haven't been born yet, you wouldn't want anything.
Yeah, that's
Well, I think it's
my-
it's
Yeah,
it's
are you a person or not? You haven't been born.
If you were in the veil of ignorance, would you prefer a society that was equal, or would you prefer one that was potentially not equal?
Well, somebody asked Mark Twain once if he was afraid of death, and he said, I wasn't alive for billions of years before I was born, and it didn't bother me any then.
Yeah.
Well,
So-
the interesting thing about the veil of ignorance is that, I mean, without taking it too literally, it's basically you're asking someone, well, if you didn't know if you're going to end up in A or B, which one would you choose, right?
Mhm.
If you didn't know, are you going to end up in, say, just to give a concrete example, in the United States or in Russia? Which country would you prefer to live in, right? So that's
Yeah.
the veil of ignorance. You don't know where you're going to end up, right?
It's
So you have to
supposed-
choose.
It's supposed to be an introspective exercise that sees if your bias or your ideas and morals align with the government that you're in at the given time. A lot of
Exactly.
people.
because you don't know if you're going to be rich or poor, for example, right? Because if you're taking it from your perspective, you know if you're poor or rich, so you're not taking into consideration how fair society is as a whole. As an example,
Yeah.
like in Greek society, I don't know if a lot of people would actually, looking at this group, we all like philosophy, so I would be very tempted to say yes, I would like to live in ancient Athens.
I won't.
But well,
Guys,
let me finish.
I'm very sorry, I have to go now, but
Bye, Mike.
you know,
All right.
Good seeing
All
you.
right, bye, Michael. Enjoy your vacation. Thanks for joining us.
Okay. You're going on vacation? Where are you going?
I'm in Texas.
Oh, shit.
What part of
Austin.
Texas? Oh, Austin's
Yeah.
nice. Oh,
Yeah,
maybe not right
Austin.
now, but
That was my home city, Michael.
Oh, really? You grew up in Austin, Texas?
Yeah, I spent like almost a decade over there.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Do you have any good places I should go to?
Well, I was always in the Latin dancing scene, so I would go watch. There's a really cool band called The Brew. These are like three or four brothers from Brownsville, Texas, and they play
Yeah,
some
with COVID, I probably won't be able to, unfortunately.
they play some excellent music in Domino's at Domain, I think.
Domain. Oh, my brother just told me about that Domain.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like a bar with like they also have like coffee and other stuff, right?
Like it's like a like they created like some sort of like a alternative to downtown.
David.
So it's like a bunch of bars and
are
restaurants.
you talking about 6th Street?
6th Street is 6th Street, so that's like downtown Austin.
Yeah, it's by
Okay.
Then for the suburbians, they created like this Domain, which is like this hoity-toity place where you can have like a lot of bars and some singing and dancing,
David,
You
I
should,
know you're not from Minnesota, but you're witnessing what's known as the Minnesota goodbye. Take notes.
Minnesota goodbye here. Go meet Joe Rogan, Michael. I think he moved to Austin.
I think I
Yeah, he
witnessed
did
that
move out,
before,
yeah.
Frank.
Well, I'm not going to interrupt it anymore, so I'll see you guys later.
You'll
Yep.
tell us
Good
about
time.
it
Nice
next
to talk
week.
to you, Michael.
Oh, actually, go to GM Steakhouse.
Oh, for the love of God.
Go to GM Steakhouse and get you a free helping of abuse with every meal.
Go to
Yeah.
the GMC house and have a hot dog.
We've already said goodbye twice, guys. Mike,
It's a
go.
Minnesota
Yeah.
Let's
goodbye.
go.
The guy go, man.
Go
He
get
has
the
better
hot
things
dog.
He's gone. He's gone.
Jesus, I
Anyways-
move out east or west once and I lose that trade immediately. You guys need to let it go.
Yep. Yeah, it's
Well,
Minnesota goodbye.
But like I was saying, Frank, the reason why I wouldn't want to live in ancient Athens is that I might end up being a slave. Maybe I wouldn't be Plato. I would be Plato's slave.
Or
so that
worse,
would
you
kinda
might be a
suck.
woman.
Or
I could be
worse,
a
you might
woman
be
and-
Socrates.
Yeah. So being Socrates, I'm sure would be great. Unless
No,
you're being-
once you would be
Yeah.
executed.
Well,
Yeah, but that was your own choice. So
Move
Now,
this.
if I
I mean,
understand,
you could change history and just be Socrates and say, "Well, I don't want to die."
if I understand correctly, the people of Athens voted to find Socrates guilty of
Mhm.
corrupting the young.
Corrupting the young and spreading his own religious doctrine is what they
And later, when they were deciding the sentence, they decided that he should be put to death.
Mhm.
The
And
funny,
actually they gave him the option of banishment.
Exile. Yeah.
They gave him the option. He didn't take it.
the funny thing is, more people voted to put him to death than voted to find him guilty.
I don't know about that. I just know the vote was about. I know the vote was around 700 on each side, and the difference was about 30 votes. This is documented, as I know it from historical texts. About 30 votes in favor of guilty. That's what
So
I-
how many people voted to put him to death?
well,
What?
the majority voted to put.
it would have been. It was
It was like a
around.
narrow
Hey,
majority.
Where is this going? Where is this going, David?
Well,
Yeah.
what
We'll
that
do a-
means, what it means, I'm thinking, is that if more people found him guilty, if more people voted to put him to death than found him guilty, that means that some of the people that voted to put him to death were persuaded by the people who found him guilty,
The people who
by the
voted him
number of
guilty.
people who found him guilty.
The
Well,
people who
and-
voted
and
him
I-
guilty were
and
voting to put him to death. It
And
was
I
the exact same
question,
thing.
I question whether that is a valid thing. If the majority wants something, is it always right?
No.
Well, that's why Plato hated democracy. That's
Right,
why he
yeah.
thought it was a terrible idea.
Okay, the Republic. He said,
Right.
you know, the philosopher kings should be, you know, governing society,
But-
not the tyranny of the masses.
Back,
But
back
Socrates also he could have lived. I mean, according if you
Yes.
take Plato seriously, he could have just apologized and they would have let him live.
Well, the whole
Or he just have been exiled.
well, the whole
Or, yeah, he could've
apology.
just-
I mean, if you read, we should reenact some of these dialogues. It would be pretty cool to reenact some of these dialogues. If you guys are up for it, I would love to do it.
I'd do the apology in a minute.
Bruno,
to the play.
all these ideas.
Well, it's great. I mean, I would have fun. You know, we'll do this, but we'll be reading Plato's dialogue. You know, it's very nerdy in terms of like a philosophy nerdy thing, but you know, it'll be fun.
I don't think it's nerdy in the least. It's.
Reenact Plato's dialogue.
I take offense.
Well, in some circles, it would be considered nerdy.
I
Like in
have
circles, except for
one
our-
idea that's even nerdier.
What's that?
That is to take Einstein's 11 thought experiments and go through them.
Well, I'm not super familiar with that, but we could also do that after we're done with the dialogues.
It would be fun.
I'm up for it.
I was
But-
saying we could reenact Plato's dialogues dressed as various Doctor Who's. That would be really nerdy.
And I know we have really diverged here, but
Except not Tom Baker.
we were talking about the apology, and I just really want to quickly state I've read all of Plato's dialogues and all of his works, and the thing is, the apology was the only time I heard from Socrates as Plato portrayed him that I thought it sounded like a real person and not just, not just a character that Plato was using to get a point across. It sounded like a sarcastic old man who didn't give a fuck about what anybody else thought about him.
Well-
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say, David. I mean, if you read the apology, which I don't know if you have or have not, but
I have. It's been 40 years, but I did read it.
but Socrates is basically telling them to fuck off. So he's
Yeah,
not he's not defending himself. He's
Not
just
an
saying,
apology.
if you have the need to do this trial, this is really something you should be thinking about. Like, what is wrong with you? Like, this is a sham, So it's not like he's defending himself.
At one point, he flat out tells him, I think I'm worthy of a banquet. You should just throw me and all my
Yeah.
friends.
Socrates and the modern equivalent would be going like this.
Yeah,
And he'd be calling them bitches. Come on, bitches. I do what I want. I do what I like.
Yeah, that's not
Get
the
off my
sign
case,
language I
bitches.
would use.
It's not like he's defending himself.
But I don't know. As to a fair or equivalent
So look,
society-
so the same thing is, in Athens, in ancient Athens, I mean, it wouldn't be great to be a slave. So I wouldn't like to live in that society if I didn't know if I was going to be a slave, a woman, Socrates,
Mhm.
or a hoplite. Doesn't matter. The chances are not good, right? The chances are you're probably going to end up in a place that you won't like.
But you already touched on a key thing. Something we discussed later is you said if you wouldn't know, if I don't
Yeah, if
know
I did-
what I'm going to be,
Well,
I-
like-
I'm not sure. I want to
in
be
the
in a
United
society.
States, right? In the United States, today, or even more dramatically so in the 50s, I mean, it's very different to be a white male and to be an African American woman, right? I mean, those are two different situations, and you can see that for a lot of different societies. So, but that I thought that's why I thought it was interesting that Michael brought that up, because it
It
does
is.
highlight the fairness aspect of societies, right?
It does.
It's very different in unfair societies. Let's put it this way. It's very different to end up in a place or the other, right? It changes things dramatically.
It really gives you a show of kind of the disparities in both ancient, modern, really any society, you really get the thing, because the places that people's minds go to when they have to perform the experiment is almost always to the extremes. If I am going to be the absolute best or the absolute worst, and it really shows you just how big of a probabilistic field there is in between these two areas. You know, we immediately went slave and Socrates. You know, am I going to be impoverished black person, you know, in America, or am I going to be Trump? So,
Oh, if I can interrupt for quick breaking news, the FDA has authorized the Pfizer biotech virus vaccine. So we do
Oh,
have
that's
an
lovely.
official, the US
That is-
has an official COVID vaccine now.
Good stuff.
all right.
So
All
I think
right, and I'm actually going to sign off tonight, but I hope you guys have a
Well,
great
I
time.
think-
I'm glad we delved into freedom a little bit.
You know,
Yeah.
Yeah, I gotta go eat here.
Well, I think that's a good time to end it then. Do you guys want to
Okay.
make some final remarks, and maybe next week we can talk about the fairness in society, veil of ignorance a little bit more. But
Sure.
yeah, thanks for coming. I mean, it was a good discussion. Do you guys
for
want to
listening,
mention
Bruno.
anything else?
I will say this. Yeah, even if I could be an Athenian full citizen, I wouldn't want to live in ancient Athens, because chances are I'd suffer some horrible staph infection or might die from having an abscessed tooth or something. Yeah, I'm happy living in a society with antibiotics. Speaking of that, and vaccines.
It helps.
Awesome. I'm still looking for help on this whole freedom quotient. So if you guys, have any input on what type of a test you would think when it
Freedom
comes
test.
down to assessing
Let's keep thinking about it. I
someone's
think that's good.
FQ.
I think
I think
I
that
will
would,
think about it, but I have no idea what you would do with it.
I think it's a factor-based thing. I mean, it's not going to be perfect. So come next
give you-
time.
I
I
could
don't
give you-
know.
Nah. I could
I
give you a set of assumed metrics that could help with the probability of freedom, but with any measured statistics, you must know that the correlations between the data and the measurements are not necessarily inherent.
You guys, I mean, same thing with an EQ and an IQ. I mean, there's always room for error. So I'm just putting it out there. But I'm going to sign
Yeah,
off
it's
for
always a
tonight.
subjective scale.
Bye,
I think we-
everyone. I'll see your rest of your comments on YouTube.
Bye,
talk
Allison.
later.
I think we're gonna
Bye-bye.
end it. So thank you so much, guys. Let's
Yep. Have a good night.
Have a
let's
good
end
night.
it here. Thank you so
Night.
much for coming, everybody.
Thanks. Bye.